Hello, I'm Bob Ross, and I'd like to welcome you to the 12th Joy of Painting series.
Yes, Bob Ross is back.
He was the face of calm, an icon of peace with a palette. But behind the canvas, not everything was painted in soft strokes. At 52, Bob Ross said something that cracked the image he worked decades to protect. It wasn't shouted from rooftops. It wasn't on TV. But it confirmed what some had quietly suspected all along. This isn't just about a happy little tree or a gentle voice on PBS. It's about a name that became a brand, and a legacy that may have slipped from the hands of the one person it mattered most to. Inside this story, a private confession, a final refusal, and a lingering question echo louder than any brushstroke. The truth didn't air in an episode. It surfaced when the cameras were off. What did Bob Ross really leave behind? And who's still holding the brush? Bob Ross's carefully protected persona. Bob Ross's success on The Joy of Painting was built on more than just his art. It was his voice, demeanor, and message of calm that drew millions of viewers. With his soft-spoken encouragements, such as, "We don't make mistakes, just happy accidents," Ross projected a consistent image of peace, patience, and positivity. He made painting feel accessible to everyone, reinforcing the idea that art wasn't reserved for professionals. His persona became synonymous with tranquility, and for many, watching his show was a therapeutic escape from the chaos of daily life. But the man viewers saw on PBS represented only one facet of who Bob Ross was. Off-camera, Ross was navigating a far more complex world. He had spent years in the U.S. Air Force, where he was known for his strict leadership, a stark contrast to his on-air gentleness. That history reveals a discipline and intensity that didn't always align with his television image. While Ross's transformation from a stern military figure to a comforting art instructor is inspiring, it also hints at how deliberate his public persona was. It wasn't fake, but it was carefully curated. Ross's devotion to keeping up that image extended to the management of his personal and professional relations. Friends and colleagues noticed that Bob avoided public drama and favored working conflicts quietly. He rarely spoke of disagreements or personal failure, especially on the business side of his work. As a result, so many people were left unaware of the interior struggles and compromises necessary to keep the joyful world that he created on screen. It wasn't deceit, but a deliberate attempt to focus on creativity and optimism at all costs. Very few people doubted what might have been hiding behind tight walls in public until recent times. Not until his death did the stories about his life begin to emerge, legal cases and betrayal in many ways, giving a clearer image of Ross's life. The contrast between the calm artist and the tortured individual who privately copes with pressure, loss, and manipulation creates a sense of dissonance. To the most ardent fans, it raised questions. What else was behind that placid face? And how much of the man behind the easel did the public ever really know? Behind the gentle brushstrokes and soft-spoken wisdom, a quiet storm had been building, and eventually, Bob Ross couldn't keep it to himself. The secret he took years to speak. Shortly before his death at age 52, Bob Ross allegedly admitted to those close to him that his relationship with Annette and Walt Kowalski had deteriorated beyond repair. While fans saw the Kowalskis as loyal partners who helped bring the joy of painting to life, Bob's confession revealed deeper concerns about their motives and control over his legacy. According to accounts from his son, Steve Ross, this wasn't just a business disagreement. It was a breaking point for a man who had spent years preserving a carefully crafted public image of harmony. Bob's unease didn't appear overnight. Tensions with the Kowalskis reportedly grew over time, fueled by conflicts about ownership of his name, creative control, and the commercialization of his image. Still, Bob kept these frustrations largely private. For years, he chose not to speak publicly about the strain in their partnership. Whether out of loyalty, fear of damaging his reputation, or simply to avoid conflict, Ross stayed silent. But as his health declined, the pressure to secure his legacy and protect his family forced him to confront the reality he had avoided for too long. The so-called confession was more than the venting of a personal grievance. It reframed decades of assumptions about Bob's business relationships. Steve Ross claims Bob was adamantly opposed in his last months to the Kowalskis' mounting efforts to take complete control of Bob Ross Inc., mainly his name and image. The timing of the confession, shortly before his death from lymphoma, apparently added to the urgency. The refusal of Bob to sign over his rights, even while very ill, indicated that deep mistrust had been fostered behind the scenes. Where Bob never spoke of his concerns publicly, the documentary Bob Ross, Happy Accidents, Betrayal and Greed became a vehicle for Steve Ross to tell what his father had already confided in him. These have cast many of the fans into a reassessment of the story that they used to believe. Were the Kowalskis intent on preserving Bob's legacy or cashing in on it at his expense? Why had it taken so long for this chapter of Bob's story to come to light? The confession was a watershed moment, not just for understanding Bob's last years, but equally for the rethinking of who truly cared about Bob's interests. A partnership turned power struggle. Bob Ross Inc. was originally founded as a shared vision between Bob Ross, his business partners Annette and Walt Kowalski, and a small group of collaborators who believed in making art accessible to the public. At the beginning, the company functioned as a platform to distribute instructional materials, painting supplies, and Ross's television program. With Bob's calming presence and unique teaching style, the joy of painting quickly became a hit, drawing national attention and generating commercial opportunities that none of them had initially anticipated. As the brand grew, however, so did internal friction. While Ross maintained a focus on creative expression and educational outreach, the Kowalskis increasingly saw Bob Ross Inc. as a business empire. This divergence in priorities led to tension behind the scenes. Ross reportedly became uncomfortable with how his name and likeness were being used for profit, especially in ways that strayed from his original mission. According to accounts from those close to him, he began to question whether the company still reflected his values or whether it had become something else entirely. How the partnership grew, first in collaboration and over time, power dynamics became so uneven that Kowalski owned the company name and structure, Ross being left with little legal option since he was and is the public face and heart of the brand. They then went further in the acts to clearly mark authority by organizing licensing deals and even transferring ownership of all intellectual property associated with the name of Ross. This almost completely cut off Bob's ability to determine how his identity was being packaged and sold, while he continued to film episodes and hold the position of the company's public face. As for Ross, the fight with lymphoma goes on, while the battle of Bob Ross Inc. has become more personal. Among Steve Ross and other insiders, it was said that the dispute reached its apex during Bob's last year when there were alleged moves to obtain full legal rights over his name. The strain was already an apparent break, though not anticipated, in a partnership that seemed to be built on mutual respect. The metamorphosis from an artist's mouthpiece into a tightly controlled commercial venture was, of course, all about the insistent tension Bob himself could no longer ignore. Rumors, relationships, and a mysterious affair. One of the more controversial and lingering rumors surrounding Bob Ross's relationship with the Kowalskis is the allegation of a romantic involvement between Bob and Annette Kowalski. This speculation was brought into the public eye by Steve Ross in the Netflix documentary Bob Ross, Happy Accidents, Betrayal and Greed, where he stated that there had been an affair between his father and Annette. The Kowalski family has firmly denied the claim, and no definitive evidence has emerged to verify it. Still, the mere suggestion of such a relationship has prompted new scrutiny over the power dynamics within Bob Ross Inc. Whether the alleged affair occurred or not, the impact of this rumor cannot be dismissed. In a tightly controlled business environment, already strained by creative and financial disagreements, any personal entanglement could have further complicated professional decisions. If true, it may have created emotional leverage or blurred boundaries in ways that affected how business was conducted. If untrue, the existence of the rumor itself still contributed to mistrust and tension, particularly between Steve Ross and the Kowalski family in the years following Bob's passing. Then, one must wonder about the timing and nature of this allegation. Why did this information surface decades later? And what does that delay indicate about the level of secrecy about Bob's personal life and professional relationships? By sharing this nugget of information, Steve seems to have contributed to an overall effort to reclaim his father's story and shine a light on what he saw as manipulative behavior from those who profited from Bob's silence. For others, it fuzzed the lines between business partnership and personal loyalty even more, and added yet another layer to the already complex history of Bob Ross Inc. To note, this alleged relationship has far less support than other speculation and has certainly not accrued the evidence to support modeling in any other way. Still, it is bound to affect the public perception of the Kowalskis' role in Bob's life. Some fans, who had always considered the partnership to be purely professional, have begun to wonder what kind of interpersonal dynamics might have existed behind the scenes. What is more, conjecture has amplified the emotional burden of the legal and ethical battles surrounding all things Bob Ross, and led many to wonder, what other secrets lie beneath the facade of the smiling artist we thought we knew? The fight over Bob Ross's identity. As Bob Ross's health deteriorated due to lymphoma, one of the most critical and distressing developments in his final months centered around the rights to his name and image. According to Steve Ross, during this vulnerable time, the Kowalskis allegedly attempted to have Bob sign a contract that would give them full legal control over his identity. Bob reportedly refused, leading to what Steve described as one of the few times he ever saw his father visibly angry, yelling, "I'm not giving you my name." This confrontation marked a pivotal moment in the battle over his legacy. Bob's refusal was not just emotional, it was strategic. He understood the value of his name, not just as a brand, but as a symbol of what he stood for: accessible art, kindness, and personal expression. Giving that name away, especially under pressure during a medical crisis, would have gone against everything he had built. Steve Ross later said that the pressure placed on his father in those final days was not only inappropriate but deeply exploitative, adding to the grief and stress surrounding his impending death. Just after Bob's dying, the legal fight did not end. The Kowalskis insisted that the vast majority of what Bob created was done by way of work-for-hire arrangements, giving them extensive ownership rights in everything. Despite the fact that Bob refused to sign his name over, Bob Ross Inc. continued to use and license his image and likeness. Steve Ross and all those other family members went to court over these claims, but they found the company's legal structure provided for a very limited remedy. In 2019, Steve lost a major lawsuit, which essentially deprived him of the ability to benefit from his father's name or protect it from commercial use he did not agree with. This fight over Bob's identity has become one of the most bitter parts of his legacy. Many fans who admired the artist for his humility and generosity are now called to question whether the current use of his name is a reflection of such values. The fact that all of these defining parts of Bob Ross, his name, his voice, and his likeness, could be kept apart from the intentions behind it remains a bitter result of the legal conflict. It raises deeper questions. Who has the right to define a legacy? And can a name owned on paper still carry the spirit of the person it represents? As the legal fight over Bob Ross's identity played out in courtrooms, another battle was quietly unfolding, this time much closer to home. The son caught between legacy and loss. Steve Ross, Bob Ross's only publicly acknowledged son, shared more than a last name with his father. They shared a deep connection through art. Steve occasionally appeared on The Joy of Painting and was himself a certified Bob Ross instructor. From the outside, their bond appeared strong, with Steve following in Bob's artistic footsteps. However, behind the scenes, their relationship was marked by periods of emotional distance and unresolved tension, particularly when it came to the expectations placed on Steve to carry on his father's legacy. Steve has openly expressed that he struggled with the pressure of being seen as Bob's natural successor. He wanted to pursue art on his own terms, while Bob, nearing the end of his life, hoped Steve would take a more central role in continuing the Joy of Painting brand. This difference in vision reportedly led to conflict and even years of limited communication between the two. Steve later admitted in the Netflix documentary that he still carries guilt over that distance, particularly during his father's final years when Bob was ill and facing increasing challenges in protecting his legacy. Despite the conflict, Steve and Bob reconciled before Bob's death. That reconciliation might have been meaningful, but it happened with great legal and emotional pressure. During the latter part of Bob's life, Steve had more involvement in Bob's affairs, for not only was he a son's legitimate counterpart, but also one of the only ones that Bob really trusted with defending his artistic values. Steve later described viewing his father being treated by those around him and how those final few months of Bob's life influenced Steve's thoughts about people his father once considered partners. The reluctant heir became an advocate for the father behind those paintings. Steve's story is also very much about being an advocate for legacy, the legacy of fine painters and artists. And one of the questions that arises: who really carries a legacy forward? Those who have the legal claim, or those who possess an emotional connection? Since Bob's death, Steve Ross has found himself in a painful situation, deeply intertwined with his father's identity, yet along with his younger half-brother Roberta, legally and financially barred from it. He had lost his case against Bob Ross Inc. and is unable to profit under his father's name or likeness. Steve continues to instruct painting, but says he does so with lingering frustration over what might otherwise have been saved by a different set of circumstances. His story not only reflects his personal loss, but it raises larger questions about who has the right to carry a legacy forward, those with legal claim or those with emotional attachment. Speculation about a hidden child. Among the lesser-known and most quietly discussed aspects of Bob Ross's personal life is the claim that he may have fathered a child during his teenage years. This possibility has never been confirmed by Bob himself or his estate, and there are no public records verifying the identity or existence of such a child. However, scattered reports and rumors have persisted for years, raising questions about a part of Ross's early life that he deliberately kept out of the public spotlight. If true, this would not necessarily conflict with the image of Bob Ross known to the world, kind, reserved, and deeply private. But it would add another layer to the portrait of a man who carefully curated what he allowed the public to see. The fact that Ross never spoke about this alleged child publicly, even after achieving widespread fame, suggests he may have made a conscious choice to keep certain parts of his past away from public consumption. This aligns with how he handled other personal matters, including his health and business conflicts, quietly and on his own terms. We are left wondering whether this rumored child later came into Ross's life in any form, actual or imagined, or whether there was ever an effort on the part of either of them to make contact or reconcile. This person has never made their own statements, has never been interviewed, nor has become involved in any alleged legal disputes. Silence breeds conjecture, yet it speaks to a larger truth about Ross himself. He guarded, until the very end, the line he drew between his public personage as a teacher and entertainer, and the private life he guarded. Thus unverified, this segment of the Bob Ross story remains firmly speculative. But even as an unverified fragment of his biography, it helps to further profile Ross as a person. Like many public figures, he may have in fact concealed things about himself from public scrutiny, and those may in turn give voice to the truth about his character. If this alleged child does exist, the speculation serves to strengthen the claim that there were chapters in Ross's life that remain closed well before the world came to know him as a gentle guide with a paintbrush and calming voice. Illness, exploitation, and final days. As Bob Ross faced the final chapter of his life, his battle with lymphoma unfolded under immense personal and professional strain. Diagnosed in the early 1990s, Ross continued working despite his declining health. Viewers saw no sign of his illness on screen. He maintained his cheerful demeanor, continuing to paint with a steady hand and gentle voice. But behind the scenes, his condition was worsening, and the people closest to him knew that time was running out. During this period, the stakes around control of his legacy became more intense. At the same time Ross was confronting a life-threatening illness, he was also grappling with growing pressure from his business partners. According to accounts from Steve Ross, this included repeated attempts by the Kowalskis to secure full legal rights to Bob's name and likeness. These efforts, allegedly made while Bob was physically and emotionally vulnerable, left him distressed. Steve recalled his father becoming uncharacteristically angry and agitated during these final months. Overwhelmed by the stress of legal threats and persistent phone calls at a time when he needed peace. Bob Ross constantly strived for art without giving in to the increasing pressure of events. Even in a state of physical weakness, he would paint, film episodes on TV, and relate to the audience. Those last paintings, made under the shadow of a terminal illness and a corporate power struggle, became more than landscapes. They became quiet acts of rebellion. Ross kept a firm hold of his life through his work, and it was this commitment at this time that speaks of a more underlying strength, that he intends to carry on teaching and making beauty as long as he can, despite what others tried to do to change the definitions of his legacy for their own purposes. Ross passed away on the 4th of July in 1995 at the age of 52. As the public grieved over the loss of a gentle artistic figure, very few knew of the dreadful storm he had gone through in the last year of his life. The stark contrast between public grace and private struggle reflects one of the most sobering facets of his narrative. In retrospect, the timing of the various legal activities surrounding his sickness raises some pretty ugly ethical questions. Was enough done to honor his wishes while he still had the ability for it? And how much of what happened after that would have differed had he not had to endure business interference during his final days? The Kowalskis' expansion and fan backlash. After Bob Ross's death in 1995, control of Bob Ross Inc. remained in the hands of Walt and Annette Kowalski. Over time, leadership shifted to their daughter, Joan Kowalski, who took over the company's direction and dramatically expanded its presence in the marketplace. Under Joan's guidance, Bob Ross became more than just a nostalgic TV figure. His likeness appeared on everything from socks to waffle makers. The expansion pushed the brand deeper into pop culture, reaching younger audiences through viral clips and branded merchandise. While this aggressive merchandising strategy introduced Bob Ross to a new generation, it also sparked growing criticism. Longtime fans began questioning whether the commercial use of his image aligned with the values he stood for: humility, accessibility, and a genuine love for art. Many were especially troubled by the fact that his family, particularly his son Steve Ross, receives no benefit from the ongoing use of Bob's name or work. The Netflix documentary Bob Ross: Happy Accidents, Betrayal and Greed intensified this backlash by spotlighting the family's legal battles and raising ethical concerns about the company's control of his legacy. In light of the documentary, Bob Ross Inc. has put out a public statement justifying their actions against charges made by Steve Ross. They reiterated that they were supposed to preserve and propel Bob's legacy, claiming that their stewardship kept his message alive. But for many viewers, the legalities cannot explain the issue's emotional core. Fans that had once found solace in Ross's soothing presence felt disquiet over the commercialization of his identity, even, perhaps particularly, at the cost of his son's voice and vision. Part of the fan response consisted of calls for boycotts, petitions that Steve Ross should be returned rights, and a much larger debate about who owns a legacy at all. If Bob Ross Inc. makes a kill from the brand, it ultimately doesn't show any sign of a fading public debate. The company may have extended the reach of Bob's image by expanding, but it also posed the question itself: is visibility better when it does not meet the cost that does not reflect the core beliefs of the artist? Thus, many concern themselves with the real issue in the controversy: respect. Some critics argue that the brand's transformation under Joan Kowalski reflects not just expansion, but reinvention, one that leans more on commercial appeal than artistic authenticity. From themed board games to quirky product tie-ins, Bob Ross's image has been stretched far beyond the boundaries of the canvas. While some see this as harmless homage, others view it as distortion, an erosion of the simplicity and sincerity that once defined him. The deeper issue isn't about socks or lunchboxes, it's about whether a legacy built on stillness and sincerity can survive in a system that prizes visibility over values. As the backlash grew louder and the merchandise piled higher, one question began to echo louder than the rest: who actually deserves to shape the memory of Bob Ross? Who really owns Bob Ross's spirit? At the center of the ongoing debate surrounding Bob Ross's legacy is a fundamental question: who should have the right to shape how he is remembered? Legally, Bob Ross Inc. holds control over his name, image, and intellectual property. But emotionally, many fans argue that his true legacy lies in the values he represented: peace, encouragement, and the joy of creating art. This divide between legal authority and public sentiment has become more pronounced in the years since Ross's death, particularly as merchandising and branding efforts have amplified his presence in popular culture. Critics of Bob Ross Inc. argue that the corporate control of his likeness has drifted far from what Ross would have wanted. They point to the flood of novelty items, from energy drinks to Halloween costumes, as examples of branding that clash with his low-key, sincere nature. Supporters of the company counter that their efforts have introduced Ross to new generations and kept his teachings alive. But this raises a deeper issue. Does visibility alone equal legacy? Or does how someone is remembered matter just as much as how often they're seen. The other side of the issue is occupied by fans, such as Steve Ross, who feel that Bob's work has suffered from unnecessary legal entanglements in contrast to the true emotional core of it. Steve's inability to profit from or control the use of his father's name resonates with those who view him as Bob's rightful caretaker. His appearance in the Netflix documentary galvanized support for a legacy based on creative freedom, family, and integrity, instead of trademarks and licensing contracts. The protracted dispute concerning Bob's legacy is not merely about ownership. It is about meaning. It is not just a matter of who owns the rights. It is also about who is accountable. Will the artist's honor lie in gaining commercial success? Or will it live on in the personal inspiration given to millions of viewers? There may never really be an answer, but now the public knows more about this case than ever before. And perhaps the greatest tribute to Ross is thus not a product or contract, but that the gentle voice of Ross still encourages people to take a brush in their hands and paint freely without fear. In many ways, the conflict has exposed the uncomfortable reality that legacy can be both sacred and exploitable. While Bob Ross Inc. holds the legal framework, fans have become the emotional guardians, pushing back not just on who profits, but on how the legacy is presented. Is it a celebration of Ross's ethos, or just a diluted echo used to sell mugs and t-shirts? When the lines between tribute and transaction blur, the risk isn't only reputational, it's personal, especially for those who saw Ross as more than a brand. What complicates it further is how the internet has kept Bob Ross alive in ways no corporation could fully control. Clips of his show circulate without permission. Artists credit him as their inspiration. Memes and fan art reframe his image on their own terms. In a digital age, control over legacy has shifted from courtrooms to culture. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real ownership lives now. Not in legal documents, but in the quiet moments when someone picks up a brush, presses play on an old episode, and feels, for a moment, like they're not alone. If this video gave you a new perspective on Bob Ross and the story behind the smile, make sure to hit that like button to support the channel. Got thoughts on what really happened? Drop a comment below. We're reading them all. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you're ready to go even deeper, click the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss what we uncovered there.